10 years ago, we produced the very first public report on cyber espionage called the Tracking GhostNet Report. This report began when the offices of the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala, India, where Tibetan government in exile is located, they contacted us. They thought that their computers were under surveillance. Maybe they'd been hacked by their Chinese adversaries. I sent a team up to Dharamsala that collected network traffic and other data, and we brought it back to our lab at the University of Toronto. And in the course of analyzing what we could see, we discovered that the attackers, the espionage operators, had made an error. Basically, they had set up a server that they were using to send commands to infected computers. They had left that open, essentially password protected. Since 2009, we've continued to do research on this topic, and the big concern for us these days is around what we call commercial spyware. So in a nutshell, whereas governments in the past would have to build in-house capabilities to engage in signals intelligence or espionage, now they can go to the private sector. There are companies that basically allow them to purchase off the shelf their own national security agency. And what we have found really quite disturbing is that in the hands of unaccountable elites, despotic governments, they're used to target journalists, human rights defenders, human rights activists, and more. To me, this is like a massive epidemic. We're talking about a pandemic right now that we're dealing with. This is an epidemic of a different sort. I believe degrading global civil society in serious ways, and it's quite disturbing. I suppose the best example of this in general, but also from our own research, concerns the connections of commercial spyware to Jamal Khashoggi, the murdered Washington Post journalist. So some of you might be aware that around the time that he was executed in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, we at Citizen Lab discovered that several of his close confidants, including a Canadian permanent resident, Omar Abdulaziz, had their devices hacked by Saudi operatives using a very sophisticated Israeli-made technology made by this company called NSO Group. What they did is they sent text messages to these targets, and when they clicked on them, the spyware would effectively take over the device. It was this way that the Saudis were able to see that Jamal Khashoggi was plotting with a bunch of other confidants how to engage in anti-Saudi activism, essentially. And it's quite likely that the surveillance that we exposed was instrumental in the decision to murder him. So that was pretty scary. Thanks to our work in exposing that type of surveillance, we ourselves at Citizen Lab became a target. So about a year ago now, I guess, we learned that there were operatives who were trying to infiltrate my lab at the University of Toronto. People assuming fictitious identities tried to lure some of my staff members into meetings, ostensibly to record incriminating things they might say about me or the lab. They didn't fall for it. Instead, we actually organized a counter sting. Journalists from Associated Press to come along. We outfitted one of our researchers who was a target with a hidden camera and a microphone, and we effectively turned the tables and exposed this operation. Well, it turned out that the group that was targeting our lab was a private intelligence company called Black Cube. Has anyone heard of Black Cube by chance? Maybe a couple people. Okay. So this is a private company that's made up of ex-Israeli spies from Mossad. Basically, their job is to uncover incriminating information meant to blackmail people. They're probably best well known, apart from targeting my lab, by being employed by Harvey Weinstein, the convicted rapist and ex-movie mogul. And you can read all about Black Cube and the targeting of Weinstein's, the people who, just before coming over here today, I was sitting in my office looking out my window. There was a parade, a Free Tibet parade. along Bloor Street. And I was looking down at this and I noticed a guy, he was standing kind of against a wall with a camera pointed against the grain of the movement of the protesters, basically standing like this, taking a snap of everyone's face. I don't know exactly what he was doing, but were that to be an agent of China's government, they could very easily take those digital photographs, upload them to an AI-enabled facial recognition system, instantly identify the people who are in that protest, and then use that information to intimidate friends and family members that may be back in China proper, or use it to engage in further fine-grained surveillance. You'd asked me to say a few things about maybe what has changed in terms of espionage since this film more than 100 years ago. I'd say the two big ones, well, the first is technology. It may seem obvious, but we're going through a profound change in how we communicate with social media, digital technologies, and so on. And in the early days when these technologies were first taking off, most people assumed that they would be a big boon to social mobilization, democratization, global civil society. And what we have discovered, in fact, is that they've really transformed the nature of political authority. They've enabled authorities to get closer and closer, in closer proximity to the people they want to control. And this is profoundly disturbing logical environment that is vastly not only transforming espionage, but empowering authoritarianism around the world in various ways. The second big difference, I would say, is in the nature of espionage itself. So when this film was made, and even most of the classic espionage thrillers that we're all aware of, the principal dynamic is one of state versus state, or spy versus spy. What I have seen, and what our research has shown, is that the nature of espionage is changing in terms of who are the primary targets. And that's a reflection of the fact that, sadly, the world is kind of descending into authoritarianism today. And for a typical authoritarian leader, a despot like Mohammed bin Salman or Vladimir Putin, the biggest threat to them is not necessarily what a government adversary, it's what a regime critic is doing, what a journalist is doing who's going to expose their abuse. And so we're seeing the very powerful arsenal that governments have at their disposal to engage in espionage being directed towards basically civil society. So we've gone from spy versus spy to spy versus citizen. In any event, with that, I hope you enjoy the film. It's certainly one that influenced me greatly, and like Yuta said, it's a landmark in the genre, the very first. So enjoy. Thank you very much.